You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. Leon Kolankiewicz is Scientific Director of NumbersUSA and Vice President of Scientists and Environmentalists for Population Stabilization. He's also a consulting environmental scientist and natural resources planner. Leon has assisted U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the preparation of long-term management plans for habitat, wildlife populations, and public use at more than 40 national wildlife refuges in many states and territories. He's the author of 2 books and chapters in 3 other books, scores of technical environmental reports, a dozen studies on population growth and urban sprawl, and hundreds of articles. Today continues a thread of chats on Rewilding Earth podcast with population experts searching for a thread of more effective conversations about human population and its impact on the natural world. The last conversation I had on population was with Chris Tucker a couple of episodes ago, and we talked about a lot of new things that you don't get to talk about much because this can be a very, very contentious topic, as we all know. What are some interesting conversations you've had that have kind of steered away from the contentious parts of it and were very, very productive?
Well, one of the conversations I had was about 20 years ago with my old mentor at the University of British Columbia up in Canada, Bill Rees, who later went on to co-found the ecological footprint concept and analysis with Mathis Wackernagel, one of his PhD students. And Bill was visiting Washington, D.C., late 90s, and said to me, if there's no other book you can read about humanity's environmental or ecological plight, I would recommend a book by sociology professor William R. Catton, Jr., entitled Overshoot, the Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change. And I'd seen that on our bookshelves, and along with hundreds of other books I meant to get to someday. And after my friend and mentor's recommendation, I grabbed that book off the shelf, took it home, and began devouring it, and learned to look at the human predicament, ecological predicament, in a different way than I had before, and in a way that didn't just sort of fall into a blame game. He looked at Homo sapiens as an anthropologist or a scientist from Mars might look at any species here on this planet or in this biosphere as one that, endowed with new capacities and new technologies, was overshooting its carrying capacity in a way that we see in nature all the time. When species get to islands and endowed with resources, there are many, many instances of this in nature. And then you get, if there are no predators and nothing else to raise the death rate for a while, you'll get rapid population growth. And that is what we are seeing in Homo sapiens, or as Bill Catton, the author of that book Overshoot, called us, tongue in cheek, Homo colossus. We were no longer just Homo sapiens, but with this technological prowess at our fingertips, each and every person exerted far more of an ecological load on the planet than our hunter-gatherer predecessors had. So the nice thing about this formulation was that it captured both the population and the consumption aspects of, again, environmental degradation or destruction of ecological capital, natural capital. So I found that to be particularly useful, and it pulled me away from this tendency that I too had to look for scapegoats here, to be blaming all of humanity or to be blaming particular groups within humanity for the predicament that we find ourselves in and still entirely haven't found a way out of yet.
We got past having to look over our shoulders all the time for danger.
Right.
we got rid of a lot of danger that faced us. So we wiped things out that got in our way, and we didn't just become the top predator on the planet. We became unparalleled. We became apart from our ability to be easily challenged and certainly extincted. Maybe
Yeah.
is a good made up word. And
Yeah.
doesn't that then fall back on us to use this awareness that we have that seems to
Right.
be fairly unique among our species, that we have to do the job of what disease or predators or things would do to other populations. We have to do that ourselves. We have to show some restraint ourselves. That's a
Correct.
first for a species, isn't it?
Yeah. We have to exercise a wisdom. I'm not the first to say this, but humanity, Homo sapiens, is right in our scientific or Latin name, is a clever species, but not a particularly wise species. We haven't been able to exercise that self-restraint that you mentioned because throughout our evolutionary history, we never had to, right? Over tens of thousands of generations, the struggle was to survive and flourish. We left part of Homo sapiens left Africa 50 to 70,000 years ago and began its march across the planet, acting as hunter-gatherers. And even before the agricultural revolution 8 to 10,000 years ago, we'd already wiped out hundreds of megafauna, right? Species that we competed with or species that we ate, species that were a threat to us. Even with nothing, little more than stones and spear tips and lances and later bows and arrows, we were able to assume that supreme role. But again, no one, a hunter-gatherer tribe in Croatia, south of the glaciers during the Pleistocene, wouldn't have known what other human beings are doing in North America or South America or Australia. Each tribe, each village, each cave was trying to survive on its own and using the tools that nature gave it. So again, tens of thousands of generations of this, and just in the last, really since the Industrial Revolution, but with the antecedents dating back to the Agricultural Revolution several thousand years ago, we are having to only now check ourselves, check this ability to be, quote unquote, too smart for our own good. And I believe that's the title of an environmental philosopher in Sweden, former Canadian by the name of Craig Dilworth. It didn't have a very happy ending because he didn't think there was much prospect of our learning in time to avoid ecological calamity and collapse.
It's really strange as culture clashes with biology. And there's so many examples of people trying to sort out why humans do the things we do, how we react in situations, how we use technology to dominate our environment around us, and technology too. So culture and technology and all these things combined with a very, very old soul called a species that has evolved over millennia, long times, long periods of time. And the body, the deep body, the subconscious even seems to want to do its procreation thing. And just like any species on the planet wants to do and is biologically driven to do. And then we have this awareness, this consciousness of ourselves and what we're doing. And then we throw in our culture around that, which is kind of like, here's the manifestation, here's how we language how we procreate like crazy, and how our mission seems to be from another planet looking down would be like, well, all these guys want to do is just grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. That's plainly the outward thing that our species is giving off, if anything else. It's just weird to watch all of this very old biology combined with this culture stuff that the religions that we use to procreate and grow and everything. I'm not saying it as well as you will, but is there anything to what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all religions, just to cite one part of culture, are pronatalist. That is encouraging their members to their feligreses, as we would say in Spanish, to go out and to how does it go, and multiply and replenish the earth as in Genesis, I believe it is, in the Bible.
Hmm.
And I think pretty much every one is the same way because they wanted to have as many followers as possible in a world that is often hostile to them and filled with other religions or cultures, villages, tribes trying to do the same thing. So, and there is something to be said for power or strength in numbers, right? To a point, until you start to exhaust the resources that it takes to maintain those numbers. If there are enough of you, then you have enough cannon fodder to resist attacks by other hostile groups or go and take their territory from them. And we find it not only in human beings, of course, but studies done of chimpanzee groups in Africa have shown similar behaviors there. So it's not something that, again, that we need to feel guilty for as human beings. We have this ancient biology that at a time when other species and other environmental checks were there to keep populations in check and keep a relative homeostasis or balance of competing organisms in an ecosystem or a community, then that it was important to have that, or you would die out and be extirpated or go extinct altogether. It's just that in the case of humanity, with our opposable thumbs, these brains that grew massively in the last several 100,000 years, it's like nature outwitted itself in a sense. We're not going anywhere. There's no other Earth out there to move off to now. We have got to make it here. This is the final frontier. And we've got to somehow find a way of reining in these passions and these instincts to always be expanding our power and our numbers. And again, numbers are a vehicle to greater power, which is inherent, I think, in the human condition and psyche, and again, in other species as well. Somehow we've got to reckon with that, and it may not come easily, or maybe we can never do it. But I think, the challenge is there, and those of us who care about a viable biosphere filled not just with, 7 billion or 8 billion human beings living on the planet in a sustainable way, but allowing the space, the resources, the ecosystems for our fellow travelers here on this planet, whirling through space to continue to survive and evolve as well.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Did you know we also publish insightful and inspirational content from leading rewilding scholars, poets, artists, and organizers from around the world? You can visit rewilding.org and sign up for our weekly digest to receive brilliant, fresh insights on everything rewilding. You'll find over a decade of articles and news from the front lines of wildlands protection and all kinds of restoration efforts. Check us out at rewilding.org, and don't forget to share it with friends. The militaristic view, the protectionist view of the more the better, the stronger we are as we grow our tribes.
Right.
That carryover never really accounted for the force multipliers that we developed, like gunpowder. And
right.
For that particular reason, we wanted protection and we wanted that strength in numbers, as you said. And then we got that. We started to develop, we got more people. Then we started to develop force multipliers. And we still kept on going with the more people thing.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's like we never realized, wait a minute, why we started doing this. And then we started to tell ourselves different stories about why we were doing this, why we were growing. Now we need to grow because it says here in this Bible, or it says over here in this. And there's compounded ways that society and culture tell us from birth what we must do. And what we must do is guilt trip people who are saying they might not have kids and say weird things like you're being selfish. Like that doesn't even make sense. That's never made sense to me. But I hear women get told that quite a bit. I've heard a woman get told that in my presence before, so I know it exists. Wow. And it's so strange. It's like such a twisted logic, but we have twisted ourselves into pretzels justifying this ever growth. Economists love to do it. And once we had the force multipliers in place for economies to grow really big and strong, two things weren't accounted for. We don't need all this people power anymore to generate value in an economy. like we did before, because we have these force multipliers that grow economies, and all of the different efficiencies that we develop to do that. And now we have these economies that depend on more bodies to fill banks, to take out loans, to generate interest, and put batteries in this big machine that we created inadvertently, not thinking at all about how its creation or growth would affect literally biodiversity. Those two worlds don't even collide to even make that question possible. Economists are so far removed, in my view, of so many real world things that it doesn't even make sense to them why we would be talking about biodiversity when we're talking about economies, because they just think one way about these things, right?
Yeah, they have a narrow view of what it means to be human and to survive on this planet, and really a lack of interest in and ignorance about the biophysical milieu that makes our survival and our prospering possible. It's only been well, not quite true. There have been economists and philosophers throughout history who have recognized the role of the environment in human well-being and what we now call sustainability. But mainstream, or sometimes called neoclassical economics, discounts the environment, the earth, the biosphere, resources as little more than another factor of production, right? That can be substituted for by capital. That is, land and resources aren't important. You can simply replace them or substitute capital for them. And there, in that worldview is just such a profound ignorance about the shoulders that we stand on in developing this complex, interconnected, global, now industrialized economy. There was an infamous remark a few years ago by an economist, Nobel Prize winning economist, Robert Solow, I believe was his name. This was back in the 70s or 80s. He made a sort of a flip remark that the world can get along now, in effect, without natural resources. And what he was driving at, again, with this narrow view, was that the natural resource sector of the economy, the raw materials as a portion or a percentage of the overall economic output, the GDP, was shrinking smaller and smaller. And therefore, air didn't matter, water didn't matter. The fossil fuels that fueled the population explosion and much of the explosive economic growth of the last 2 centuries didn't matter, because what this economist saw was that they're just 3% of the economy. Let's just get rid of that 3%. If we were to get rid of that 3%, we still have 97% of the economy, which is growing. So that is the worldview that ecological economists, beginning back in the 1960s, took issue with, because they were grounded in a much more ecocentric view of the world, starting with people like Kenneth Boulding, the fellow who famously, former president of the American Economics Association, a professor of economics at the University of Colorado at Boulder, who made that famous quip that to the effect that only madmen and economists believe that growth can continue forever. Words to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there were other pioneers like Herman E. Daly, Louisiana State University, later the World Bank, and then the University of Maryland, who began to develop what we call steady state economics, which looked to minimize, which saw the human economic system as embedded within the global ecosystem, the ecosphere or the biosphere, right? And inherently limited by it, and began to look at sustainability, environmental sustainability as a goal, and trying to conceive of ways where it would be possible to minimize the so-called throughput of the flow, that is, of energy and materials through the economy, while maintaining a reasonably stable and satisfactory standard of living and quality of life. But they have been, this has been, I've been calling an emerging field for decades now. It's been around 50 years. It has never been accepted by mainstream or neoclassical economics. So it's been given short shrift, marginalized, and who knows what it'll take for this very sensible form of economics to become the mainstream.
none of the progress that we talk about on these types of chats is possible without governments and without politics. I mean, that's just the way. And I think that's one of the reasons that what you just said is so true. It's been out there, but we've made no progress whatsoever on it all this time because the people who don't want to talk about it have found it very easy to bury the topic. I mean, what level of change are we looking at here?
I would say a profound, fundamental, or revolutionary change, Jack, and maybe we can do it in an evolutionary manner. But the fact is that both mainstream political parties and all of the non-mainstream ones are wedded to growth. They are equally wedded to growth. Everyone believes, and there's some truth to this, that a rising tide lifts all boats, as it is said. But there isn't any acceptance. Again, this is on the part of both Democrats and Republicans, to say nothing of libertarians or others, even Greens nowadays. There is no acceptance that that tide can't rise forever. Where's the water going to come from? And more generally, where are the resources going to come from? So a lot of the supporters of this incoming administration, of course, are thrilled to get rid of the Trump administration and its many atrocities vis-a-vis the environment. But still, you are dealing with political interests here that are very much wedded to this model, neoliberal, as you called it, model of growth ad infinitum, right? And it can't happen in a finite world without major hell to pay. So over the long, I've always taken the long range view of this. I wasn't as freaked out when the Trump administration came in because I'd lived through 8 years of the Reagan administration back in the early and well throughout the 80s, pretty much most of it. And Trump, in my view, is worse than Reagan for the environment and sustainability. But you know, the earth and even wilderness areas in this country survived 8 years of Reagan in the 1980s. But we still didn't get off the unsustainable track that we are on, both in terms of this ideological addiction to growth. And you took the words out of my mouth when you said worshiping at the altar of growth, or as the great population pundit and physicist Al Bartlett used to put it, in growth we trust. That's our de facto national motto, not in God we trust. And what the Democrats, just to criticize them for a moment here, seem to have forgotten is that population is part of the picture. Liberals slash Democrats at one time were very supportive of the population issue, of acknowledging that there were limits to population growth, and it would be better for us to voluntarily abide by those limits rather than having nature do it in a, you know, four horsemen of the apocalypse type way. But as a result of the changing demographics of the country, Democrats 2, 3, 4 decades ago, and liberals and even the environmental community itself began to pull away from or distance itself from the notion that it was very important to stabilize United States population and maybe even shrink it to a more manageable and ecologically sustainable size, say 100 million to 200 million. Still a lot more people than the critters we would have displaced, but a lot better than the 330 million that we're at now, and climbing with no end in sight by 20 to 30 million every decade. And Democrats and even environmental groups, as I say, seem to have no problem with that. They believe that we can be technological wizards and enact all manner of techno fixes, green energy, on steroids, plaster the landscape with wind turbines and photoelectric panels. And that'll take care of everything with no need to limit our wants and demands, including the want for ever more children or ever larger population in the country. So again, kind of stepping back and looking at things more from a long-term perspective, although I'm happy that this administration, at least superficial, not just superficially, ANWR is an important issue. I worked as a wildlife biologist in Alaska, and I would hate to see oil drilling on the Arctic plain there north of the Brooks Range. That's the grandest wilderness left in North America, perhaps. And many, I'll be happy to see greater support for renewable energy, although I'm not convinced that renewable energy is even enough to see us through. It has been noted by other engineers and environmental scientists. Well, the energy sources, the sun and the wind that we are tapping into will last as long as the sun does, another few billion years, according to the astronomers. The materials it takes to build those contraptions, wind turbines, photovoltaic panels, etc., are not renewable. And they tend to wear out in a matter of 10 to 30 years and have to be replaced. That is a big uncertainty, I think, dogging renewable energy. And we're still too new at that game to be able to be certain whether or not it can do the heavy lifting given our current population size and concentrations. So I don't think we can just assume that it's a savior or a silver bullet.
Everybody's heard this stuff. Everybody hears it every Earth Day. All of these numbers come out. Everybody goes crazy for a day, and then they all go right back to everything before. Maybe it's a storytelling thing. Maybe we have to capture people's imagination of what could be. Do you ever fantasize about what a society of the future, taking into account everything that you know and everything that you've talked about today? What does some of that look like? How can you language that for us?
Well, I do think it is possible to maintain a positive or optimistic outlook towards the future, even recognizing that we must, quote unquote, live within limits, right? We accept that with regard to our own lives as individual human beings. Nobody ever expects or demands to be able to live forever. We accept that after 70 years, 90 years, what have you, and it's increased thanks to all of these, improvements in nutrition and medical technology, that we accept that at some time our days must end, but that we as individuals can still lead fulfilling lives, and that if anything, for it to last forever would fill us with ennui and with boredom. So I think it's possible to feel that way about human civilization as a whole, and with regard to the planet or the biosphere as a whole, and look at this magnificent oasis of life we have in a vast desert, as it were, of cosmos out there, on which, as of yet, we have found no evidence of life anywhere else. There is something called the rare earth hypothesis, that the conditions, the astronomical and geological conditions that occurred here on Earth may be exceedingly rare throughout the galaxy and even the universe beyond that. But even if it isn't, the fact is that again, all we have to do is look at the other planets in this solar system to know how special a place this is, and that we need to revere it and treat it as good stewards and as children of that planet. Hence the Gaia hypothesis of James Lovelock, the British atmospheric scientist, and Lynn Margulis co-invented that concept. So I think there are ways of doing this without having to be thought of as tree huggers, right? We've got to be both pragmatic, but be guided by kind of a long-term spiritual wisdom that may actually be in younger generations, and even some of us older folks, beginning to emerge as the multiple sort of encroaching crises that we face get ever closer and bear down on us.
Tell us what kind of homework you would like everybody listening to this to do to learn more about the particular ways in which you're concerned with and working on the population and biodiversity issues.
I've done a number of studies looking at how population growth in various cities and states of the country has driven rates of sprawl that gobbles up and permanently devours open space, which is made up of important agricultural land and natural habitat. But more broadly, I would encourage people to look at some of the environmental philosophers and this idea of carrying capacity, which I think is very important, because it relates to truly what our long-term prospects are here. And one can certainly look that up online. I would highly recommend this book I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, Overshoot: The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change, by William R. Catton Jr. The foreword in that original edition, University of Illinois Press, 1981, was written by none other than Stuart Udall, the former Secretary of the Interior under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and a very, very, kind of profound and love. Both of those two people I admire very much and had the great pleasure of knowing and getting to work with early in my career, both of them. I just admire the wisdom that exudes from those pages.
Leon, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you come back.
Thank you, Jack. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.